Hello and welcome to ThePrint. Today we're joined by a columnist, Kapil Komireddi, who is also the author of the book Malevolent Republic. Thank you so much for joining us, Kapil. Today we're talking about the recent escalation of tensions between India and the governments of Canada and the US. You just wrote a very popular opinion piece for the Canadian publication, The Globe and Mail. So for those who haven't read it yet, can you tell us a bit more about why India might view Canada as not just an adversary, but a sanctuary of choice for Sikh separatists?
Because that is a fact. Canada is home to the largest population of Sikhs outside of India. It's home to about 800,000 Sikhs, and a minority of them are supporters of Khalistan, but they're a very organized minority. And nowhere else in the world do they enjoy the kind of support and political backing as they do in Canada. And then, for instance, Pradeep Singh Nijjar chose Canada. He arrived in Canada in 1997 on a forged passport, reinvented himself as a cleric, traveled to Pakistan, mingled with convicted terrorists, came back to Canada, was murdered in Canada, and he seems to have become the cause, the hill on which Justin Trudeau wants to incinerate the relations between India and Canada. And obviously, the bombing of Air India flight in 1984, in which 329 people were killed.
The Kanishka flight.
That's correct, yes. And nobody has been convicted, nobody has been sent to prison, nobody has been punished for that. And this is a country where you can commit an atrocity on that magnitude, the worst atrocity in the skies prior to 9/11, and still get away with it. That is extraordinary. And that is probably why that, people say when they're young, they make lists of universities they want to go to. And if your aspiration is to become a mass murderer, I think the places you tick off are Canada. I want to be there. That's going to be my future home. And that's really tragic. That's bad for India, but it's also harmful for Canada in the long run.
Since you brought up Kanishka, I just wanted to point out that two of the names that have re-entered the news cycle recently are two of the people who were allegedly conspirators or co-conspirators in that particular case. And so there have been allegations that India has sort of taken matters into their own hands. But that point brings me to the fact that there obviously is a massive trust deficit between India and Canada. Do you think institutional memory is sort of playing a role here in this most recent diplomatic spat?
Certainly, there's a strange kind of symmetry here. 50 years ago, India had a diplomatic spat with Canada in 1974. The Prime Minister then was Pierre Trudeau, who sanctioned India because India conducted a nuclear test using plutonium procured from a reactor built by Canada in Bombay. That really upset Trudeau, and he made public his correspondence with Indira Gandhi. And the Indians demonstrated that they hadn't actually violated any of the terms with Canada, any of the terms upon which they entered into this agreement with Canada. And what is remarkable is that Canada expected the entire Western world to stand with it. And even though many of them were dissatisfied and rebuked India for conducting a nuclear test, they went back to business as normal with India, even during the Cold War. And Canada found itself in a rather lonely position. Right now, things are somewhat different, of course, because there is an alleged Indian spy has been charged, a former Indian spy about whom you wrote so well, you profiled recently, has been charged in America. So this comes on the back of that, or rather that comes on the back of this. So India's image, I would argue, is somewhat tarnished in the West without hard evidence being produced. But I think eventually, I think if history is a guide, we will move past this. But Canada will have a reckoning to do with the kind of people it has imported home, the kind of people who have become politically influential, the kind of people who, rather than pledge allegiance to the country that has given them citizenship, whose nationals they are, want to kill and die in the cause of this bizarre fantasy of erecting an ethno-religious state in India, repartitioning India, converting Punjab into a quote-unquote sovereign state. That is such a laughable idea, but there are people willing to die in that cause. And I fear that their rage will be sublimated into something very sinister within Canada if Canada doesn't come to grips with it.
You brought up Pierre Trudeau, and it seems like his son Justin Trudeau sort of just yesterday, the former Indian envoy Sanjay Verma, kind of gave an interview accusing Trudeau of wrecking ties with India. What are your thoughts on this very public breakdown of diplomacy?
It needn't have been so public. The Canadians chose to make it public. Last year, Trudeau, made a dramatic announcement in Parliament without producing a shred of evidence to implicate India, claiming that Indian officials were involved in staging an assassination on Canadian soil, and the relationship wasn't going to recover from that blow. Prior to that, Trudeau's record in 2018, he came to India and twice, on 2 occasions, a man convicted of terrorism was invited to an official reception with the Minister of Canada. And the former foreign policy advisor, Omar Aziz, has written about how Trudeau his government ignored India's repeated requests to act against men based in Canada who were intending or had been involved in staging terrorist atrocities in India. And the foreign policy establishment within Canada, the bureaucracy didn't take that seriously either. And I think this matter is a culmination of years of intensifying frustration on both sides. But I happen to think, and I don't say this because I'm Indian, objectively, I think India's grievance is more valid here because Canada complains that India interferes in Canadian affairs, but the opposite is actually rather true. It was Justin Trudeau who interfered in India's domestic affairs when he took a stand during the protests in India, the farmer-led protests in India in 2020. And India didn't. Imagine if India were to invite and give refuge and argue on behalf of Quebec separatists who are involved in mass murder or are intending mass murder. And then imagine a flight, a Canadian airline were to take off from India and 300 Canadians were to be, killed in that, and India refused to act on that. Imagine if Quebec separatists were to be based in India and plotting very publicly to bring down Canadian institutions and to kill Canadian politicians. I rather think there would be a very serious expectation that he or she be extradited to Canada, and I think India would cooperate. I obviously believe, and all of us should uphold the idea of due process, but Canada was just not willing to entertain India's requests to take its concerns seriously.
A lot's been brought up about the difference in the way that the Indian government has interacted with the Canadian government versus the American government. I wanted to ask you about that. Do you think that there is a quote-unquote right way to go about doing something like accusing another country of, espionage?
Right. I think what happened with the Americans, I obviously, we will find out the facts. India denies that. India claims that this man who's been accused is not a serving member of India's spy agency, that he was fired. He's an accused in a trial.
In an extortion case in Delhi, yes.
Yeah, so he's, is America right to do this? Of course, if one of its citizens, if they have reasonable grounds to believe that a citizen of their country is about to be assassinated, then it would be wrong of them. They cannot overlook that and still claim to be a country governed by laws. They have to do that. What I think, if India did indeed do this, I think it did it rather shoddily. I was told this by an American former diplomat years ago, that hitmen do not exist. Professional hitmen simply do not exist. It's a myth. It's a fantasy invented by writers of fiction. Anyone who claims to be a professional hitman for hire is working for the government. That is 9 out of 10 times that's a fact. And the way in which this was carried out, the reason this should concern India is because it demonstrates how shoddily India's external intelligence service seems to be working, if this is indeed true. India's films have portrayed, RNAW as some sort of a really brilliant force, and they seem to be doing their job so poorly, if this happens to be true. As far as India reacting differently to America, that is a question for Indians to ask. India's political establishment appears over the years to have reposed a great deal of faith in America. It seems to have become a victim of its own lies. It led itself to believe that America would do anything for India. That is not the case, and that it would handle delicate situations differently. And I think this should prompt, I hope this will prompt India to reassess its pro-American literature of the past 20 years. And that would be a good thing for India to do.
A couple of things I want to follow up on, but before we move on from this, like you said, this sounds it sounds almost like a film plot, right? And the whole saga sort of raised several questions on India's intelligence setup, like how robust its tradecraft is and what recruitment standards are like, right? Do you think this really important question is sort of being buried beneath the diplomatic spat?
Yeah, of course it is being buried, because it would require political accountability. And whenever democratically elected politicians are involved, they don't want to take accountability. The way India's external spy agencies run, it has virtually no accountability. It reports directly to the Prime Minister. I think there needs to be very urgently structural reform, not for any other reason, not to, that needs to happen because India is a nation that claims to be run by laws. You cannot have a spy agency that is above accountability. We have no idea who they report to, how they function, where they procure their funds from. You cannot scrutinize their actions. And something like this happens, and we end up reacting rather hysterically to this. Suddenly, in the press, foreigners are demonized. I think we need to ask ourselves, I think this is an occasion to turn inwards and ask ourselves some very difficult questions. That would be very profitable for us, and that would help us in the long run. And I think that's this sort of the drama that is unfolding in the press and in television studios is meant to some extent to eclipse that, to obscure that urgent work that India needs to do.
Mm-hmm. I want to come back to what you said about India-US relations. The Spectator recently republished a piece that you wrote in 2022 on whether the India-US relationship can last, right? There was one line in that piece that really caught my attention, and I'm going to read, India's leaders envisage an external role its internal realities simply cannot sustain. Do you think that still holds true in India 2024?
Absolutely, it holds true. I've always been astonished. I reviewed a book by an Indian writer based in London who wrote that the world is waiting for India to play a major part, and I found that laughable. So many of the people who make these claims work in think tanks, and they meet people much like themselves. They have no exposure to the world beyond that tiny world with which they interact. They live in bubbles. They're very solipsistic. They do not seem to travel. You travel a lot in India. You report very perceptively from India. You wrote about the battles of people who work on very small wages, very low wages. It's a bizarre desire to want to become a dominant power. What does that mean in practice? You've got to ask yourself, what does it mean to be a major power? What does it mean to be a superpower? Does it mean that you're just going to bully others around you? Does it mean that you're going to interfere in the affairs of others? The aspiration of any country should be to ensure that its citizens are well taken care of. Is that true of India? Can you, hand on heart, claim that India is a happy place for its citizens? No, it's not. You step out of your office, you will see the distress on the streets. It is almost biblical. In 2024. Yes, India has built up a formidable defense sector. It has a powerful army that is again, armed forces that is again in need of very serious and very urgent reform. But this is a fantasy that Indians have been chasing for the past 30 years since liberalization. which I think just doesn't align with its internal realities. When you come out of the Delhi International and you drive into the city, you see, your eyes meet the most extraordinary poverty en route to the city. And I think the priority should be to ensure that every Indian can lead a life of dignity. And to make this point is not to insult India. In fact, it is to demand dignity for your compatriots, just not to insult India. And anyone who feels insulted by it reveals more about himself or herself than he or she conceals. I think this is an absurd quest to be a dominant power, to interfere in the affairs of countries. I've always believed, and I've written about this very consistently. This piece has just come to people's notice, but I've written rather consistently about why chasing this, status is not the right way to expend India's political energies, its time. We have other priorities. This is a country of 1.4 billion people, extremely diverse, with many fault lines, and it's a bizarre thing to want to go around dominating other countries. Talking about our influence in Europe, in Africa. Yes, we should aim to have friendly relations. We should, of course, secure our trade ties. We should, of course, ensure that our supply lines are protected. These are all necessary items. But then everything else is surplus to requirements. Everything else is to do with the fantasies of a very, very tiny elite who are not very exposed, I think, to the realities of India.
Mm-hmm. So, you're saying that on one hand, India has just cause to be angry about these accusations. And on the other hand, we're seeing in real time how the Anglosphere sort of, closing ranks around Canada and the US in that sense as well, closing ranks against India. So there's also a sort of reality check that's happening for India on the global stage. Do you think the Modi government has taken the right policy position with regards to this?
What is its policy position? I'm not familiar with its policy position. I think its foreign policy is driven primarily, I think, by vanity. Many of the choices made by Modi were impulsive in the beginning. I think he did them because he was treated rather lavishly in foreign capitals. He made an order for dozens of jets in France without the knowledge of his own foreign secretary. He made an announcement abruptly. In the course of a speech, he revived the logistics agreement with the United States without actually consulting anyone that had been buried by UPA. Many of his most significant actions aren't exactly thought through, but he's got an army of people, apologists, who will say anything he does. He goes to Pakistan without informing anyone in 2015.
Mm-hmm.
We'll say that is just the most brilliant stroke of diplomacy by the Prime Minister. Then he severed all ties with Pakistan, and the same people will say, "Wow, genius." This is our foreign policy revolves around one man. And prior to him coming to office, it was about, Manmohan Singh was driven by wanting warm relations with America. And it wasn't really, deep assessment, deep analysis of what that would mean. I think a non-aligned India was an India that was that didn't seem to owe anything to anyone, that acted according to its principles. And already, getting closer to the United States has meant that being lectured by the United States, being told by the United States how to run our own affairs, being told that we have to behave ourselves in a certain manner in order to be considered worthy of their friendship. Generations of Indian politicians managed to lead India without actually subjecting themselves to that kind of condescension. And the myth that India is the superpower is just not reconcilable with the way in which India has just been corralled into a corner by the Anglosphere. All of this fantasy that has been sold to the Indian public is being shown up for what it is, a fantasy.
That reminds me of this one line in an opinion piece that the Globe and Mail published last week, where it said that India was acting like a schoolyard bully towards Canada, but then was scared of intimidating or, angering an even larger schoolyard bully, which is the US. So there was this kind of this kind of behavior that was happening. But I want to come back for my last question. I want to come back to the people who might actually be involved, like affected by this. Canada is also a country where racism is on the rise again. There is a right-wing government that's looming. We have a highly visible diaspora population. Are you worried that this could negatively affect the Indian or the Indo-Canadian diaspora in Canada, living in Canada?
It's a difficult one. I'm not that worried about them. I think they are, how do I phrase this? That's almost a first world problem. I'm a victim of racism in the West. I worry about people in India. I worry about people who aren't able to make ends meet. I worry about people, I travel a lot in India. I meet a lot of people who are victims of a very cruel and very indifferent system. I recently, about 3 weeks ago, I met some widows whose husbands had been killed without due process. I worry about them. Canadians facing discrimination of Indian origin, yeah, come back to India. I don't really have time for them. They should pursue other channels. Of course, nobody should be a victim of discrimination, but on the chart on the hierarchy, that they don't deserve. I don't have to feel a great deal of sympathy for them. I think there are other people doing that. I think there's a whole division devoted to their feelings in the Ministry of External Affairs.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today and chat with us about what's happening. Thank you for watching, and please keep watching The Print for similar such content.